My friends, I want to tell you about a mistake I made in my early 60s that took me years to fully understand. A mistake born entirely from good intentions and a lifelong belief that genuine honesty meant sharing everything, freely and completely, with nearly everyone in my life. I had just received some difficult news about my own health, and within days, I had told nearly every friend, neighbor, and extended family member I encountered, believing that this openness reflected courage and authenticity rather than the quiet vulnerability it actually created. I did not yet understand something I would eventually learn the hard way: that information, once shared, can never genuinely be recalled, and that not everyone who receives our most vulnerable truths is equipped, or even genuinely inclined, to hold them with the care we naturally assume they will. Over the following months, I watched my private health struggle become, in various distorted forms, a subject of community speculation, unsolicited advice from people with no genuine standing to offer it, and, most painfully, a subtle shift in how several acquaintances began treating me, with a kind of cautious pity I had never asked for and did not welcome. I discovered that certain people I had trusted with this vulnerable information had shared it further, without any particular malice, simply through the ordinary carelessness of casual conversation, until a private medical matter had become, within a matter of weeks, considerably more publicly known and publicly discussed than I had ever intended or consented to. I want to be honest with you that this experience initially left me feeling foolish, wondering how I could have been so naive about something that, looking back, seems almost obvious. But I have since come to understand that my own instinct toward complete, unguarded openness was not naivety at all. It was a genuinely held belief, taught to me across an entire lifetime, that withholding information from people I cared about represented a kind of dishonesty or emotional distance I should actively avoid. It took me considerable time and several more difficult experiences to finally understand that discretion, practiced wisely, is not the opposite of honesty. It is, in fact, one of the deepest expressions of genuine wisdom available to any of us, and I want to share with you today everything I have come to understand about why, and where, this particular wisdom matters most. The single insight underlying everything I am about to share is this: not every truth you carry is owed to every person you encounter, and learning to distinguish between genuine honesty and unguarded, indiscriminate disclosure is one of the most important, and most difficult, lessons available to anyone determined to live with genuine wisdom in their later years. For most of my life, I believed that withholding any information from someone I cared about represented a kind of quiet dishonesty. I finally understood, through considerable painful experience, that genuine honesty concerns never lying about what is true, while discretion concerns the entirely separate, equally important question of who genuinely needs, or deserves, to receive a particular truth at a particular time. Everything that follows is simply this one insight, appearing across the many different rooms of my life where learning it, often painfully, eventually proved essential. The first place this insight proved itself was in that initial health disclosure I have already described, where sharing my diagnosis with nearly everyone I encountered produced considerably more distress and complication than the more measured, selective disclosure I eventually learned to practice with subsequent health matters. I discovered, through this painful early experience, that sharing significant, vulnerable information only with people genuinely equipped to hold it well, my spouse, a small handful of close friends, my doctor, protected both my own privacy and my own emotional well-being considerably more effectively than the indiscriminate openness I had originally practiced out of a genuine but misguided belief that this openness reflected admirable courage. The second place this insight proved itself was in sharing details of ongoing family conflicts with acquaintances and more distant friends, disclosures that, I eventually recognized, often did considerably more to entrench and prolong these conflicts than to genuinely resolve them. I recalled numerous instances of venting honestly about a difficult ongoing dispute with a sibling to people who had no genuine ability to help resolve the underlying situation, disclosures that occasionally found their way back to the sibling in question through the ordinary channels of a small, interconnected community. Adding an additional layer of complication and hurt to a conflict my venting had never actually helped to address in the first place. The third place this insight proved itself was in sharing details of my own financial circumstances with extended family and casual acquaintances, disclosures that, as I discussed in an earlier reflection on the same subject, occasionally invited presumptuous requests and awkward positioning I could have avoided entirely through greater discretion from the outset. I recognize that financial information, once shared, tends to circulate and be remembered considerably longer and more specifically than most other categories of personal information, making discretion around this particular subject especially important to establish and maintain consistently. The fourth place this insight proved itself was in sharing my genuine, unfiltered opinions about various family members with other family members, disclosures that, however honestly intended, frequently created triangulated tension and divided loyalties that a more measured, private approach to these opinions would have avoided entirely. I discovered that sharing my honest frustration about one sibling directly with another sibling, rather than addressing the concern directly with the person actually involved, or simply holding this frustration privately when direct address was not genuinely warranted, consistently produced considerably more family tension than the more disciplined discretion I eventually learned to practice. The fifth place this insight proved itself was in sharing details of my own marriage's private struggles with friends during a particularly difficult period. Disclosures that, I eventually recognized, made an already difficult private matter considerably more complicated by introducing outside opinions and involvement into a situation that my wife and I ultimately needed to resolve primarily between ourselves. I came to understand that certain categories of private struggle genuinely benefit from limited, carefully chosen disclosure, perhaps to a trusted counselor or a single close friend, but rarely benefit from the wider, more casual disclosure I had originally practiced out of a simple need to process my own difficult feelings aloud with whoever happened to be available to listen. The sixth place this insight proved itself was in sharing my genuine private doubts about various family decisions, particularly regarding my own children's parenting choices, doubts that, once shared even with well-intentioned friends, occasionally found their way back to my children through circuitous social channels, damaging trust that considerably more careful discretion would have protected. I recognize that private doubts about a loved one's choices, when this loved one has not directly requested my honest opinion, are often better held privately or, when genuinely warranted, addressed directly with the person involved, rather than shared more broadly with people who have no genuine standing in the matter and no genuine ability to keep such sensitive opinions appropriately contained. The seventh place this insight proved itself was in sharing the specific details of a friend's own private struggles this friend had confided to me in genuine trust, with other mutual friends who I mistakenly believed would offer helpful additional perspective or support. I discovered, to my genuine regret, that betraying this particular confidence, however well-intentioned my motivation, damaged a friendship considerably more than any benefit the additional perspective I had hoped to provide could ever have offered, teaching me directly and painfully that confidences shared by others in trust deserve a considerably higher standard of protection than my own personal information alone. The eighth place this insight proved itself was in sharing details of my own past mistakes and regrets too freely with people I had only recently come to know, disclosures that, however genuinely intended as honest vulnerability, occasionally shaped these newer relationships around my most difficult history before any genuine foundation of trust and mutual understanding had actually been established. I came to understand that genuine vulnerability, shared too early and too broadly, can actually undermine rather than accelerate the development of authentic connection, and that allowing trust to develop gradually, sharing progressively deeper layers of my own history as genuine mutual trust actually warranted, produced considerably healthier and more sustainable new relationships than my earlier habit of immediate, unguarded disclosure. The ninth place this insight proved itself was in sharing my own genuine political and social opinions too freely in mixed company, disclosures that occasionally created unnecessary division and conflict in settings, family gatherings, community events, where genuine harmony mattered considerably more than winning any particular argument or having my own views fully known by everyone present. I discovered that discretion around certain especially divisive subjects, practiced selectively depending on the setting and the genuine purpose of a given gathering, protected relationships and community harmony considerably more effectively than my earlier insistence on always making my own views fully and immediately known, regardless of context or consequence. The 10th place this insight proved itself was in sharing details of my own charitable giving and volunteer contributions too freely, disclosures that, I eventually recognized, occasionally diminished the genuine, unself-conscious quality of this giving by transforming it, at least partially, into something offered with half an eye toward the social credit it might generate. I came to understand that certain forms of genuine generosity are actually strengthened, rather than diminished, by discretion, allowing the giving itself to remain motivated purely by genuine care rather than becoming entangled with any secondary desire for recognition or approval. The 11th place this insight proved itself was in sharing too much detail about my own retirement planning and estate decisions with extended family members, disclosures that occasionally produced awkward, premature conversations about inheritance that would have been considerably better addressed through more formal, deliberate channels at an appropriate time, rather than through casual, incomplete disclosures that left considerable room for misunderstanding and unspoken expectation. I recognize that certain categories of information genuinely benefit from being shared through deliberate, formal conversation, with an attorney present when appropriate, rather than through the casual, piecemeal disclosure that my earlier openness had tended to favor. The 12th place this insight proved itself was in sharing my own private struggles with faith and spiritual doubt too broadly within my religious community, disclosures that, however honestly intended, occasionally invited unsolicited correction and concern from people whose relationship to me did not genuinely warrant this level of access to my private spiritual life. I discovered that reserving these particular reflections for a trusted pastor, a spiritual director, or a small handful of close friends who had earned genuine trust protected the integrity of my own spiritual exploration considerably more effectively than the wider disclosure I had originally practiced. Disclosure that occasionally left me managing other people's discomfort with my doubts rather than genuinely working through these doubts myself. The 13th place this insight proved itself was in sharing details of a grandchild's private struggles, academic, behavioral, or emotional, with extended family and community members, disclosures that, I eventually recognized, were never genuinely mine to share so freely, belonging instead primarily to the grandchild and their own parents to disclose as they saw fit. I came to understand that even information I received honestly and directly, as a genuinely involved and loving grandparent, does not automatically become mine to distribute further, and that protecting this particular category of information required a discipline I had not previously considered necessary. Given how naturally proud or concerned grandparents tend to want to discuss their grandchildren's lives with anyone willing to listen. The 14th place this insight proved itself was in sharing too much specific detail about a friend's health crisis, information shared with me in confidence, when other mutual friends asked me directly for an update, disclosures I offered readily out of a genuine desire to be helpful, without first confirming that my friend actually wished this particular information shared this widely. I learned, through this specific experience, to ask directly, before ever relaying someone else's private information to a third party, whether they were comfortable with this particular disclosure, a small habit of confirmation that has since protected me from repeating a mistake that, though well-intentioned, genuinely damaged a friend's trust in me for a considerable period afterward. And the 15th and final form this single insight takes, the one that ties every other form together, is simply this. Discretion is not the opposite of honesty, it is honesty's more mature companion, asking not only whether something is true, but whether this particular truth, shared with this particular person at this particular time, genuinely serves love and wisdom, or whether it simply serves an old, unexamined impulse to be fully known by everyone, regardless of the actual cost this indiscriminate disclosure so often carries. For most of my life, I believe that complete openness with everyone represented the highest form of honest, authentic living. I finally understood, through considerable painful experience, that genuine wisdom requires a more discerning honesty, one considerably more selective about which truths belong to which relationships, and considerably more protective of both my own vulnerability and the genuine well-being of the people and relationships this information ultimately touches. My friends, I want to be clear that nothing I have shared with you today suggests you should become secretive, evasive, or emotionally withholding from the people who genuinely deserve your honest openness. My spouse, my closest friends, my own trusted confidants continue to receive my genuine, full honesty about nearly every significant matter in my life. What I am describing today is not the abandonment of honesty, but its refinement, learning to distinguish between the relationships and settings where full disclosure genuinely serves connection and wisdom, and the far more numerous relationships and settings where this same disclosure, however sincerely intended, tends to create complication, vulnerability, and harm that more careful discretion would have avoided entirely. I think often of that early health disclosure, shared so freely and so widely, and how differently that particular season of my life might have unfolded had I simply practiced the more measured discretion I eventually learned only through the discomfort of that painful experience. I do not believe my original impulse toward openness reflected any genuine character flaw. I believe it reflected an incomplete understanding of the actual relationship between honesty and wisdom, an understanding I have spent the years since carefully, deliberately refining, one difficult lesson at a time. I want to share one further reflection before we close, a simple practical test I eventually developed that has served me well in the years since. Before sharing something genuinely significant, I now pause and ask myself 3 brief questions. Does this particular person genuinely need this information to support me or to make a decision that actually affects them? Is this person genuinely equipped, based on their own demonstrated discretion and character, to hold this information with the care it deserves? And am I sharing this from a place of genuine connection, or simply from an old, understandable impulse to process my own feelings aloud with whoever happens to be present? This small pause, taking only a few seconds, has spared me a great deal of the regret that once followed my earlier, more automatic openness. If you are watching this today and you recognize, in your own life, this same instinct toward complete, unguarded disclosure with nearly everyone you encounter, I want you to know that developing greater discretion does not require becoming a fundamentally different, more guarded person. It simply requires pausing, before sharing something genuinely significant or vulnerable, to honestly ask yourself whether this particular person, in this particular setting, is genuinely equipped to hold this particular truth well, and whether sharing it genuinely serves connection and wisdom, or simply an old, understandable but ultimately costly impulse to be fully known by everyone you encounter, regardless of whether they are genuinely positioned to receive this fullness with the care it deserves. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope something I shared helps you recognize your own particular patterns around disclosure, and gives you the wisdom to distinguish between the relationships that genuinely deserve your full openness and the far more numerous relationships and settings where discretion, practiced thoughtfully, will serve you, and the people around you, considerably better than unguarded openness ever could. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Remain genuinely honest, but pair this honesty with the discernment to know which truths belong to which rooms. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. Stay honest, stay wisely selective, and remember, Not everyone who asks for your story has earned the right to the whole of it. Thank you for watching.